This video can be watched as a standalone production, but it's also the conclusion to the 4-part video series on the history of Christian heresies. Yes, YouTube, this presentation was originally given in a Unitarian Universalist church as part of a workshop I was invited to give on the history of Christian heresies, as a result of the reception I received from my deconversion story given last summer. So keep in mind, all this was originally presented in a church. A bit of background. The early church father Epiphanius wrote an account of Christian heresies called the Panarion, which means medicine chest in Greek. His intent was to provide antidotes to the bewildering variety of Christian heresies circulating from the earliest times of Christendom through the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Yet, in exploring these heresies, combined with background information from secular sources, it is possible to arrive at a shocking thesis on the origins of Christianity. We won't go into all 80 heresies Epiphanius attacks, but just a few, to provide background information, and to demonstrate the weaknesses in the classic assumptions about Jesus and Christianity that we all learn in Sunday school, or Sabbath school for me. I'll give a brief overview of some of the most extreme sects and the ways in which they contradict each other. In essence, a challenge to explaining Christianity is trying to explain how all these divergent groups could possibly come from the words and deeds of a single teacher. First, consider a group known as the Ebionites, holding to a natural Jesus adopted by God for his Jewish perfection, totally Torah observant. But they would have been opposed to the cult of Marcion, who loathed the Jewish law and taught that Jesus magically descended from heaven with no childhood. Marcion actually composed the first Christian Bible. This challenge to the Orthodox Church actually provoked the Bible we have now as a response. And then we have the Phoebianites, from whom Epiphanius narrowly escaped when 2 seductresses attempted to introduce him into their cult. They had developed a 365 god sex liturgy. Apparently, by coupling with different sexual partners and moaning out the name of a different heavenly spirit, your soul is supposed to pass through a heavenly realm in multiple stages and commune with the ultimate divinity. So, ask yourself, even if some Jew could come up with an idea as blasphemous as a mass religious orgy, could such a teacher also inspire the straight-laced Ebionites? And remember, all these groups, 80 heresies total in Epiphanius, they all think they alone are the true, authentic Christians. So to puzzle out the origin of these cults, we need to go back as far as we can, back to the earliest 1st century, to see what was really known about Jesus from contemporary sources. This should give us some insight into the true origins and teachings of the earliest Christians. And what do historians find that attempt to do this? Nothing. No mention at all. The Gospels describe a gigantic movement through Galilee and Syria, where Jesus was known to many. Signs and wonders and more signs. And yet, there were dozens, perhaps over 100 writers whose works survive in some form. The atheist writer Michael Palkovich thinks he can identify 130 potential writers who should have been able to notice Jesus, but did not document him. Ultimately, estimates vary. But there were many writers who had a chance to observe events in Galilee in the first 3 decades of the 1st century, and they have nothing to say. No writer of those days noticed Jesus at all, nor do his disciples seem to merit any notice by secular contemporaries. And their job, in theory, was to go out and get noticed. But no mention is given of Jesus of Nazareth by secular sources for decades after his apparent life. But that is not the end of the story. Though it does constrain our search, and creates certain new questions. How is it possible for a man that went unnoticed by secular history to have been worshipped as a demigod so soon after his death? And why is there such diversity? Finding the Jesus of history is a daunting task. Every once in a while, a scholar comes out with a new pet Jesus theory. John Dominic Crossan thinks he was a rural cynic philosopher. Agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman thinks he was a failed apocalyptic prophet. Those are just two out of dozens of opinions. I remember once visiting my family in the Chicago area. Most times I would have a chance to talk with my crazy Aunt Doris. She had run away from the family for many years to live with a sect that preached Jesus was a black man. My parents shook their heads in bemusement. And yet, so little is known with any certainty. Jesus is the first feminist, the first Marxist, a first-century Che Guevara, revolutionary, rabbi, Korean, black, hippie, or alien Jesus. Images abound. And for 200 years of academic Jesus studies, there are no facts that can be objectively demonstrated about his life. Australian scholar Raphael Lataster and historian Richard Carrier have stated that all methods used by traditional Jesus studies are historically invalid based on a meta-analysis of everyone who has surveyed the field of Jesus studies. They've all concluded the methods used to determine and identify the historical Jesus are invalid. The turn-of-the-century scholar Albert Schweitzer is credited with the remark that scholars who study Jesus end up projecting themselves into their work. But surely there must be some historical truths to be known for certain. And that was the purpose of my childhood church, to go back to the beginning, beyond the Catholic accretions, and get back to basics. For the historian who tries this, chaos ensues. To put some of these historical challenges into perspective, I need to tell the twisted tale of the Nazi Bible and Hitler's Jesus. In the heyday of Nazi power, the order was given to commission the creation of the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German church life. Their mission statement was just what it says. But in their attempts to create a bastardized Nazi syncretism, they stumbled upon some interesting facts. It turns out there is a Jewish polemic circulating in some old Talmudic writings that do actually describe a Jesus the Nazorian. But he is also described as Jesus ben Pandora. The claim is that in reality, Mary was not a virgin, but simply a woman who had a steamy affair with a rugged Roman soldier nicknamed Panthera. And there is a play on words between a common descriptor for Roman soldiers and the actual word Pandora. It was a form of ancient libel. Literally, Jesus ben Pandora translates to Jesus, son of the unfaithful. The Nazis exploited these distant links and created a propagandistic Jesus in which his mother was not truly Jewish and his soldier father was actually an Aryan, putting emphasis on his clearing of the temple money changers. And if you really wanted to know more, you could read all about that in a book by Walter Grundman, Jesus the Galilean, around page 155. But oddly, there's a strange nugget of religious history here that goes back to the 1st century BCE. It turns out that the monk Epiphanius, who barely escaped the seductive wiles of the Thebianite women, has more to teach us. He mentions a heretical sect called the Nazorians. They are Christians who also hold to the Jewish law, but they preach a different Jesus, as reported by Epiphanius. They believed in a Jesus born in Bethlehem in the time of a king known to scholars as Alexander Jannaeus. You can look him up. One of the Hasmonean kings who ruled in wait for it, 70 BC. Bah, don't put too much stock in that, critics say on ChristianForum.com. But that's not the point. The issue isn't whether the claim is true. The issue is that such a claim exists at all. Instead of focusing on how wrong they must have been, we should be asking how such a belief could possibly come about. May the Nazorians and the heretics be suddenly destroyed and removed from the Book of Life. Owen Chadwick, The Early Christian Church, Penguin 1967, from page 20. This quote is attributed to the 80s AD. Nazorian Christian sects have been known from the beginning and are likely the earliest form of the church. But if our gospel-centric narrative we presume were true, how could anyone possibly become convinced that the real Jesus lived 100 years earlier? Or vice versa, if the Nazorians were correct, how could later Christians believe in a Jesus who died under Pontius Pilate? I suppose it's not unlike a civil rights activist giving a speech commemorating the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. by Jefferson Davis in 1865. Ask yourself, why did they believe this? Not only are there disagreements over when Jesus was born, and a few years difference is quite conceivable for normal historical people, but there are various Gospels that cannot agree on who killed him. Exhibit A, the Gospel of Peter. Yes, it's apocryphal. But people didn't know it was apocryphal until the Catholic Church said so. Here, Jesus is crucified under Herod Antipas, son of the dastardly slaughterer of the innocents, as told by Matthew, who ruled in a different region from Pontius Pilate. As strange as the fact that supposed eyewitnesses could be confused by what country they were in, and the name of the leader involved in a public spectacle, was the fact that this story was accepted by many churches. Our friends the Ebionites, they used this gospel, believing that Jesus died in a totally different country, condemned by a different ruler. If they were able to accept this, it becomes evidence that there were no known historical facts to contradict it. If the canonical gospel narratives were generally known as history within the early church, getting the Ebionites to accept the narrative of the Gospel of Peter would be like convincing Texans that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated inside the Soviet Union. But there was no knowledge preventing them from embracing the apocryphal claim of Peter's alleged gospel. This confusion serves as evidence that even in the early days there were no certain facts about Jesus to be known at all. But if so little could be known with certainty about Jesus, then what was it that made these diverse groups all worship him in the first place? Secular history does not mention Jesus directly in any contemporary sense, but there is mention of him later by a few writers. One in particular. Josephus. My dad kept his collected writings. One in particular concerns us, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, as follows. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him,